So I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's lecture. I guess it's my pleasure on behalf of the Department of Architecture to welcome you and welcome Jenny Sabin specifically to the Stuckeman School here at Penn State as part of our fall lecture series. Jenny is enormously accomplished, so I will just share a few sort of highlights from her CV and then try and explain partly why I'm so excited that she's and appreciative that she finds the time to be with us for the coming minutes to share from her experience today. Jenny is an architectural designer who works at the forefront of new directions in architectural practice today and very much active and engaged at the interfaces between architecture and science and connecting between biology and mathematics through materials into structure and architecture. One thing which is interesting is that she actually began her work, her career in the visual arts with degrees in ceramics and interdisciplinary visual art from the University of Washington and a Master's of Architecture with honors from the University of Pennsylvania, where she was awarded the AIA Henry Adams First Prize Medal and a host of other awards. You are probably somehow familiar with her work. It's been published in really so many public sort of periodicals and outlets of note. But I would maybe highlight that one thing which is particularly interesting is that her work, which has evolved over a series of exhibitions, has been very active in connecting between what we might do within the world of sort of schools of architecture and connecting to outside what some people might consider to be the standard domains of architecture and engaging technology companies. She's also published 2 books, including Meander in 2010 and Lab Studio in 2017. And she is now the Arthur and Isabel Weisenberger Professor in Architecture and the Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Architecture at Cornell University, where she established a new advanced research degree in matter design computation. She's also the principal of Jenny Sabin Studio, an experimental architectural design studio based in Ithaca, and the director of the Sabin Design Lab. Now, finally, just to sort of bring it back to where we all are, I just wanted to mention that I think one thing which is particularly meaningful for all of us here at Stuckeman School is that we're all trying to make sense of how to use research in the work that we're doing. And this can become particularly daunting today when there's so much computational and computing power that can be available as a resource for us as designers. And this calls for really radically new frameworks for merging knowing with modeling, with making, and with doing. And Jenny Sabin is really one such person, a true design visionary who has demonstrated the possibilities for merging materials, design, science, engineering, and aesthetic modes of research into a simultaneous web that is architecture. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Sabin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DK, for that kind introduction. It's really a sincere pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I also would like to thank the Stuckeman School and the Department of Architecture for your invitation to lecture in your fall department series. I haven't had the opportunity to lecture previously in the department and at Penn State, so it's a pleasure to be here tonight. So the title of my talk is Biosynthetic Architecture, and I have divided the talk into 4 sections. The first, which will be somewhat brief, is really about the foundation for the work, describing some of the key concepts and certainly collaborators that have influenced me, have inspired me, and have helped to develop both my research as well as my practice work across disciplinary boundaries. The second section will unfold adaptive materials looking at projects that have spanned roughly from 2010 to now. And then thirdly, I'll be moving into non-standard structures with a focus on 3D printing and one specific media, ceramics. As DK mentioned, I do have a degree in ceramics, a prior life, but that knowledge has come back in an interesting way. And then I'll conclude with the fourth section, which is focused on adaptive environments and specifically looking at textile processes as a ground for working analogically between biology, nature, us, and how we occupy urban space. So thanks again. I'll go ahead and move to my next slide, and please, interrupt me if for some reason my internet goes out or you suddenly can't see my slides. So I'd like to start with these two exquisite drawings. The one on the left is a drawing by John Piper that was used as a front piece for a seminal book by Conrad Waddington, who was a pioneering developmental biologist. And the title of the book is Organizers and Genes. And what we see in this image is essentially a representation of the epigenetic landscape. And I'll be talking about epigenesis and specifically matrix biology and what we mean by context in that light as I move into the next sections of the talk. So in the image, which is intended to represent, as I mentioned, the epigenetic landscape, we see a rare view behind the scenes of Waddington's landscape. Each valley in the landscape, which we can see here, is formed by tension on this network of guy ropes that is then attached to nodes of genes, which we can see here. So the DNA in the story. And importantly, I'd like to reference a quote by Sanford Quinter in an essay that he wrote in 1993 for Assemblage, which is titled Landscapes of Change, where he states, quote, epigenetic landscape seen from below. And he's talking specifically about this drawing that John Piper developed based on Waddington's work. The complex relief features of the epigenetic surface are themselves largely the expression of a prodigiously complex network of interactions underlying it. The guy ropes are tethered not only to random points on the overhead surface, but to points on the other guy ropes as well, and to the pegs in the lower surface that themselves represent only semi-stabilized forms, thus multiplying exponentially the non-linearities flowing through the system. Not to diminish in importance either is the tension surface above as a distinct domain contributing its own forces to the field. No change in any single parameter can fail to be relayed throughout the system and to affect, in turn, conditions all across the event surface. So here we're looking at systems, at relationships, feedback, and importantly, reciprocity between environment and the morphology of development in nature. On the right, we see a drawing by one of my heroes, Robert Laricolet, who was a structural engineer that really was a polymath. He taught in architecture. He developed a lab at the University of Pennsylvania attached to the Department of Architecture. And he also was very interested in looking to nature for design models, not to mimic their form or to simply bring an image found in nature into a different context and to scale that up. But he studied specifically Radiolaria exoskeletons, these sort of amazing micro scale creatures, to understand how forces were flowing through geometry and matter. And he worked in the analog. And if he was practicing today, I would guarantee you that he would be at the forefront of really investigating how computational design and digital technologies and fabrication could be used as a bridge. And he's importantly the pioneer of the space frame, which is now ubiquitous in our built environment, corrugated sheet metal, and many other spatial systems. But the point I want to make is that he didn't start out by saying, you know, I'm going to design the space frame with a predetermined notion or idea of structure and form. But it emerged through a process of understanding and looking at behavior and the dynamics of behavior, and importantly, integrating materiality, geometry, structure, context, and so on. So this way of working, which is frequently bottom up, integrates geometry, pattern, materiality, our own bodies, is something that is embedded in all of my work. And so similar to how I've described these two amazing drawings, we're interested in looking at the processes and the behaviors behind the images of these natural systems as important ecological models for bringing to design. And I'll be unpacking that further as we go through the talk. So we start with very simple parts and rules that through feedback and iteration produce much more complex spatial wholes. The cardinal rule to complexity is simplicity. So we start simple. This interest also probes the productive tinkering and misuse of digital fabrication machines frequently found in alternate industries, such as in the automation of the production of automobiles or in textile industries. This is also importantly informed by issues of craft and making to produce bio-inspired material systems and software design tools that have the capacity to facilitate embedded expressions in our built environments. This is also filtered through material organizations to produce models that are at once natural and artificial. And importantly, we contribute to core science. It's never been about, you know, turning architects and designers and artists into pseudoscientists or scientists into pseudo-designers, but to come to problems, to develop problems collaboratively in a truly collaborative space. And these are some images of covers of publications that we've been featured on the left, one of our early projects by Lab Studio, Branching Morphogenesis, which took first prize in the International Visualization Challenge hosted by AAAS and Science Magazine. And more recently, on the right, a collaborative paper with colleagues here at Cornell exploring metabolism and programmable matter and the synthetic use of DNA in that process. And again, a couple of additional journals that we've participated in, working collaboratively across the studio and the lab. So one of the fundamental questions that we ask is, how might buildings and architectural elements and their integrated materials behave more like organisms, responding to and adapting to their local contexts? So thinking back to the seminal messages and learnings of Conrad Waddington and Robert Lericolet in this context. So I'd like to say a few words about some of the important collaborators that I have worked with, I've had the pleasure to work with over the years. For the longest time, Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones, who is trained as a matrix biologist. He's a cell and molecular biologist. And we started a hybrid research and design unit when I was teaching at Penn in 2006 called Lab Studio. And Peter introduced to me, along with his postdocs and fellows in his lab, to the extracellular matrix. And these are some of the cardinal features of the ECM, which again influenced a way of thinking that is about looking at how context specifies form, function, and structure. And so for many years, I worked on core research with Peter, with my students and others, looking at the architecture of this environment that cells were interacting with and being affected by. So the big message here is that half the secret to life resides outside of the cell. So you have DNA or code, which certainly contributes to form and morphology. But that DNA is acted upon by protein events and other external dynamic conditions within the ECM. We recently published a book titled Lab Studio Design Research Between Architecture and Biology, which captures this unique time between roughly 2005 to 2011. And when I look back on those years, I think one of the most important contributions that we made, and of course the projects and the research and the tools and all of that are important, and they were really exciting. But I think the most important contribution was a way of working collaboratively and the development of a truly collaborative space. We all know that there are lots of buzzwords around cross-disciplinary and innovation and so on and so forth. But when it gets down to it, it's really difficult to collaborate successfully across disciplines because of many reasons. We have different structures in place for how we teach, how we conduct research, how we garner funds. You know, a $2 million grant in the sciences is a small grant, whereas in our field, that's massive. Different structures and modes for how we publish. And also, probably most importantly, we communicate differently in terms of language and so on. And so one of the things that Peter and I did early on is that we spent a year just figuring out how to talk to each other. And he came to my studio reviews. I attended his weekly lab meetings. And it was through the course of that year that we discovered that while we had many like terms, we had very different definitions for those terms. And so we were developing a space of trust, a space of exchange, which I think was probably one of the most important things that we could have done in terms of the contribution to time and giving it the time that it needed. It was during that time that I also started working with Dr. Xu Yang, who is a material scientist, and she engages biomimicry in the true definition of the word. She extracts rules, principles, characteristics from natural systems to develop entirely new materials that frequently are programmable and adaptive. She looks at the feet of gecko to produce sticky materials. She looks at the leaves of lotus plants to develop superhydrophobic or superhydrophilic materials, or water absorptive or water repellent materials. And she also works with the concept of structural color, looking at the wings of the blue morpho butterfly, for example. And I'll come back to structural color in a moment. And then more recently, I've been collaborating with Dan Lau and Shogo Hamada here at Cornell. They're in biological and environmental engineering. And they are just doing some incredibly creative work with 3D printed hydrogels, designing and engineering with synthetic DNA to get those materials to actuate based on their own material makeup. And I'll come back to a project that we've been working on more recently, working with fluorescence and DNA as a design driver. So over the years now, over 15 years, which is hard to believe, it's gone by very quickly. We've developed a way of working that typically starts with the generation and design of new tools to model behavior and process. Sometimes that's based on data emanating from cell biology. Other times it's driven by a particular algorithm or a set of material characteristics. I like to think of software as a new type of material. So we write a lot of scripts, we develop our own tools. And then some of those successful tools are brought into the realm of architectural prototyping. and productively contaminating the process with the stuff of making, and also grappling with scale. You know, not all of these systems and processes are scalable. And then finally, moving some of those successful prototypes into the built environment and considering building ecology. So it's a purposefully slow process. It's rigorous. And part of that is, again, to responsibly and meaningfully deal with the problem of scalability and to embed relationships along the way. So it's frequently bottom up. I usually start a project not knowing what the final form will be, which is also a very difficult thing to teach in terms of the studios and design seminars that I teach at Cornell here, as well as my research associates in my lab, which I'll come back to. So moving into the second section, which is on adaptive materials, this section really takes root in that primary question that I posed in terms of considering how materials and buildings analogically could perhaps behave more like organisms responding to their local environments. And you'll see there are a number of crossovers and synergies among the next three topics, but they do have their sort of specificity. And I'll briefly touch upon this project eSkin, which is now about 10 years old. We started it in 2010, but it was a really seminal project. The topics of which I continue to explore in my lab in terms of designing with light and energy and looking to nature for design models to consider adaptive processes in architectural materials. This was also our first big collaborative grant, which really was important in terms of getting an institutional stamp from the National Science Foundation, indicating that what we were doing, which was really cross-cutting and high risk and experimental, was being taken seriously. And so the NSF had put out a call for collaborative teams that would include architects. And there was a Penn State team that was also successful. And we were one of the 10 teams across the states to procure one of these grants. And thankfully, we had a few years under our belts at that point within Lab Studio. And I think that really helped us be successful. And this is the team, as you can see, spanning multiple disciplines. The program that the NSF had put out was to grapple with the problem of sustainability in buildings, especially high-rise buildings, to consider solutions and new paradigms for how we deal with building heat gain and the overall carbon footprint. But they were also fundamentally interested in just reconceptualizing our whole approach to that problem. And so we proposed to develop thin film technology and materials that could be integrated into either existing energy inefficient facade design in buildings or in new facade design for new construction. And so we started with this topic of dynamic reciprocity, which goes back to some of the concepts that I unfolded with Conrad Waddington and John Piper's drawing, as well as discussing the extracellular matrix. And so what you see here is a single smooth muscle cell, which has been plated onto an organic polymer. And this polymer has been fabricated in the material scientist lab. And we, the architects, were contributing to the design of these various geometries, their arrays and configuration. And what we were interested in is how the behavior of the cell, and you can see the internal cytoskeleton lassoing up and around these pillars, how changes in the cell behavior would affect the environment and vice versa. So how changes in this environment in terms of geometry, materiality, compliance, etc., would in turn impact the behavior of the cell. And you can see here moving from pillars on a grid to a wrinkled surface and how that has a dramatic effect on those cells. we were by no means proposing to put cells on buildings. That would never work. The cells would quickly become sick and confluent and they would die. But at this scale of the research, the cell was our protagonist. The cell was our muse. We were extracting behaviors and principles to then design sensors and imagers with the mechanical engineers that could learn from their local environments and respond dynamically. So as we began to scale, there were many different parameters that we could work with. And we decided as a team to focus on structural color. And structural color is not pigment-based. It has everything to do with the behavior of light and human perception. And so through the manipulation, the design and engineering of textures and geometries at the nanoscale, we could then, at the macro scale, the human eye, develop materials that would dynamically switch from transparent to opaque, or also dynamically change their color. So just to give you a little bit of insight, and I won't go into too much detail, if you're interested in taking a deep dive into the technical aspects of this project, there are a number of papers published on my lab website. But basically, when we stretch one of the samples of the E-skin material, all of those pillars or holes that started out normal to the surface would change their orientation, and in turn, light would reflect and refract differently, and we then perceive a color change or a dynamic switch from transparent to opaque. One of the hurdles that I had to grapple with early on is that most of my collaborators, and to this day, engage in what's called fundamental research. And it's not that they're not interested in application and scalability, they just don't do that. And so as the architect on the team, I was constantly pushing for, okay, we proposed to the NSF that we were going to do building skins. When are we going to start to, move into that? And so we developed a whole series of scaled prototypes. We had to develop our own rendering software to manage the data that we were extracting from the E-skin material, working at the human scale with these simulations, then moving to a room scale, and then finally developing a prototype from scratch. This took us about 2 years working alongside each other at the lab bench side and the studio that really demonstrated all of the research in an interactive way. And just to give you a little bit of background, what you see here is an array of sensors that detect subtle changes in light intensity, an array of components composed of conductive glass, or what's called ITO glass, and sandwiched between them a solution of nanocolloidal particles that exhibit structural color change. And so when these sensors detect a change in light intensity by either passing your hand in front of it, such as Shu is doing here, or walking into the room, a very low voltage is passed through, and the packing density of these nanocolloidal particles also in turn changes, which changes the way that light is interacting with that material at that specific wavelength in terms of the material's texture. And then we, in turn, perceive a color change. This is now part of the permanent collection at the Froc in Orléans, just outside of Paris. This is our vision for where E-skin should go next, and the reality of moving an entirely new material into industry and into construction and the built environment. From day one to that final point can be upwards to 20 years. So we're now actively looking at other research grants and industry partners to help us scale this and move it into the vision that you see here in terms of a thin film building skin being integrated with facades. More recently, we've built upon all the successes of E-skin in the context of a new grant that we've been working on for the past couple of years in collaboration with Mariana Bertoni, who is an engineer with expertise in photovoltaics And we have been looking specifically at designing with light and energy, but importantly looking at aesthetics and beauty and the equal importance of aesthetics and beauty in the context of sustainability with optimization, performance, and function. And so through the integration of various filters that feature color change due to structural color, as well as incorporating 3D printing to work with non-standard components as a system to develop a non-mechanical tracking system that can work more functionally from a performative standpoint with light and energy in terms of how UV is being absorbed by the PVs, how it's being reflected back, and so on. And then also importantly, turning to nature as a guide to explore topics such as heliotropism, looking at sunflowers and how they turn and adapt to the presence of the sun, or light scattering within examples such as a living stone plant. And you can see how we're correlating analogically some of these important features from the stone plant into our system, and also developing strategies for how these components pack and aggregate. We're at the sort of demonstrator phase right now, looking to go after a couple of new grants to really fabricate and build a demonstrator pavilion to test this both here in Ithaca, but also at Arizona State University, where Mariana is based. And most recently starting to look at agrivoltaics, which you can see in this middle image here, which has loads of potential in terms of solar energy collection, as well as working with the shade of these systems to couple that with the growth of plants and farming and permaculture. And so this is an ongoing project, but really exciting for us in terms of pushing forward over a decade of work, looking at how we design dynamically with light and energy, and to incorporate both performance, function, but also human perception and issues of beauty and aesthetics to inspire large-scale transformation amongst communities in terms of how we work with these technologies at a human level across multiple scales. So at this point, I'm going to shift into the third topic, which is related, but deviates in terms of considering not only adaptive materials, but adaptive structures and form. And specifically working with technologies and digital fabrication methods pertaining to 3D printing. And one particular media, that being clay and digital ceramics. Just to give you a little bit of background, we purchased our first 3D printer in 2009 as a part of Lab Studio. And at the time, it featured the largest build bed on the market. It's a powder-based printer, still in my lab here at Cornell. And I was very interested in working with the 3D printer, not as a representational tool, but to rapid manufacture parts at scale. Peter and I were also very interested in the promise of holding data. And if we could hold data emanating from his lab, how might that contribute to the scientific process? How might the scientists project into the questions and the hypotheses being formed in a different way? And so we were developing these prototypes based on confocal microscopy stacks of multicellular structures, developing parametric models, and then developing printable models from that, just as a series of inquiries moving from visualization and simulation to printed form to this. And this is when I kind of had this amazing aha moment during a sticky summer in Philadelphia in the middle of August when we were working on a few of these projects, where all of my knowledge in clay, my BFA in ceramics, and I was active as an artist producing work for a number of years before I went to graduate school in architecture. And I realized that I literally had this body of knowledge that I could bring to a new context. And so what you see here are our first successful 3D printed greenware parts. We extracted the proprietary media out of the printer because I, in doing these projects, thought, well, wait a minute, we could maybe print other types of materials. And I mixed up a bucket of high fire dry stoneware, mixed it with a little bit of maltodextrin and sugar, all off the shelf grocery materials, and took out the binder and put in a solution of water and alcohol. That is why there is vodka in my lab. We use it for the printer. And actually, Mark Ganter, if you're interested, he's an engineer at University of Washington. He was one of the first to really start to tinker with these things. And we had some early conversations around that. And this just blew me away, you know, that we could start to work with clay and print clay. And it opened up a whole series of new trajectories and questions. And so you can see here the same part printed in the proprietary media and then printed in the high fire stoneware, then bisque fired, so chemically changed to ceramic, and then glaze fired. So we immediately have material constraints like shrinkage that come into play. This opened up, as I said, a whole series of new research questions, as well as teaching agendas, design studios and seminars and research topics focused on digital ceramics, which I continue to teach. And in my lab, we have focused in the last 4 years on the brick. And, you know, the brick is a really interesting subject. One, it's very accessible. You know, a lot of people have been really interested in the work that we've been doing in that light. And also the brick hasn't changed a whole lot because of how they're made for many, 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 many years. I mean, we could go back to, you know, the Roman period and look at how bricks were being produced, and it's not all that dissimilar to how they're produced today. But with 3D printing, every single brick can be different. We can start to think about hollow bricks and porous bricks, mortarless connections. And so this is Polybrick 1.0. And recently, in the last year and a half, we've been working on Polybrick 2.0, which turns to nature for inspiration in terms of looking at human bone formation and the specifics of human bone formation in optimizing for load paths and the paradox of building with holes. And we find this everywhere in nature. Systems that are highly porous, are delicate locally, but globally are incredibly robust and very strong. So we've been collaborating with Dr. Christopher Hernandez and various students and research associates in my lab, and research seminars have been contributing to this work. Dr. Hernandez is a mechanical engineer with expertise on bone mechanics. And so we have been looking at the optimization of load paths, but also considering more phenomenal issues of, you know, what does it mean to have a porous or hollow brick wall where we can actually see through it and let light pass through. And just to sort of make the point further, if we were to look at a scan of human bone from, say, a runner to a bicyclist to a swimmer, the density of those leg bones, for example, would be very different based on the load conditions that they're constantly subjected to. So this has presented a series of really interesting design drivers and engineering drivers to work with. And at the same time, with Dan Lau and his group, we have been spearheading Polybrick 3.0, which is working with synthetic DNA, specifically DNA that contributes to these fluorescing light properties, so light emission, and using that as a dynamic glaze. And to our great surprise, we've had a lot more success with this than we originally anticipated, and have discovered that clay is an incredible host for life. And so the first phase is to design and steer the DNA within a hydrogel to 3D print these smaller tiles. So we've gone back down in scale a bit to get particular light patterns and signatures. We've begun to scale this up to a tile size, a typical tile, which this has been a really exciting leap in the work because we're working at scale, working with 3D printers to print microtextures that contribute to the different fluorescing patterns in relationship to the DNA. And considering other opportunities, not only light emission, but our next phase is focused on detecting particular proteins and particulate matter in the local context and air. So imagine if a wall could tell you if your local environment was dangerous based on a color change or light emission. And at best, imagine if a wall could clean its local environment. So these are some of the questions that Dan and his team and my team are working on within the Polybrick 3.0 and these latest tiles. And then lastly in this series, and this is relatively new, we've been really pushing the microtexturing, working with a Formlabs printer. Working with porcelain that has a bit of resin in it, and that allows for the curing of the 3D printed part, and then it's burned out during the firing process. And what's so cool about porcelain is there's no aggregate in it. So all of the porous areas, when the resin burns out, don't remain porous. They actually get filled in with the ceramic material. And so being able to print at a micron scale allows us to extract properties and characteristics from natural systems. I mentioned the lotus leaves. There are many others that are water repellent. And so you can see in this example how we are able to control and direct the flow of water. And this is a tile sitting at 90 degrees where the water is housed and staying within those little dimples because of the microtextures. So we're starting to think about, imagine tiled walls that could passively cool, could direct water to plants, and so on and so forth. And I'll transition to this video just to visually depict many of the concepts that I've just described in the various phases of polybrick and digital ceramics. And can you hear the audio okay?
Actually, we don't hear the audio.
Okay. Let me just...
Maybe if you try unplugging your...
Yeah. How about now?
Yes.
The production of ceramic blocks and tiles has a long technological and design history. Ceramic modules of standard measurement have been used as building block in replacement of stone for many centuries. Ceramic bricks and tiles, so ubiquitous in their application in the built environment, have surprisingly lacked recognition as a viable building component in contemporary architecture practice until now. Polybrick, our latest endeavor under the topic of digital ceramics in the Sabin Design Lab at Cornell University, showcases next steps in the integration of complex phenomena. This work includes advances in digital technology, 3D printing, advanced geometry, and material practices in arts, crafts, and design disciplines. The first phase of the Polybrick series features the use of algorithmic design techniques, for the digital fabrication and production of non-standard ceramic brick components for the mortarless assembly and installation of the first fully 3D printed and fired ceramic brick componentry. Polybrick 2.0 is generated with the rules, principles, and behavior of human bone formation. This allows for the production of variegated bricks that are light and porous at the top of the wall and dense at the base to carry load and maintain efficient structural integrity, while also amplifying material and formal expressions. Polybrick 3.0 takes our material investigations to the next level. Synthetically designed with advanced bioengineering, these biobricks will exemplify the cutting edge and future of biologically steered clay and ceramic building blocks in architecture. The two prototypes utilize 3D printed clay, hydrogel, and synthetic DNA. As you can see here, a unique ID stamped with DNA in the form of a C for Cornell is fluorescing within the polybrick clay body. Brick stamping has a long history where variegated size, shape, and stamping indicate place, date of construction, and type, and thus serve as invaluable historical documents. With our unique DNA stamps and glaze, we explore the possibility of live signatures and dynamic surface techniques, coupled with non-standard bricks in the context of living matter and digital ceramics. And again, if you're interested in, can you hear me okay? Great. If you're interested in learning more about any of those projects, we have a number of published papers on the sabinlab.com website where you can learn a lot more detail on technical ins and outs. So this brings me to my last topic, looking at adaptive environments, and really also features some of the largest work, outdoor semi to permanent work that has been ongoing in my practice for the last decade plus, and considers the question, how might we design and enhance architecture with the bioarchitecture and behavior of our own bodies and local environments. And as DK mentioned in his kind introduction, I wear many different hats. I direct the Sabin Lab here at Cornell. First and foremost, I'm an educator. And my practice is separate from the lab, but conceptually very linked. It's funded differently. The pace of the work is different from the lab. In the lab, we have an opportunity to chase a question for sometimes up to 4 years or more. So there's a slower but rigorous arc, whereas the practice engages, fast-paced schedules, client needs, budgets, and so on. And oftentimes, when I take on a project, there might be aspects of the research conceptually or more directly where a certain material system or concept has reached a level of maturity and is ready to be brought to application at this scale. And so I'll start with Lumen, which was our winning entry for the Young Architects program put on by MoMA and MoMA PS1 in New York City. We were very fortunate to be finalists in 2017, and we won, which was an amazing moment in my career. And as you can see, taking on this important project that many emerging architects pay attention to takes an army of incredibly talented people, collaborators, contractors, of course, students, my senior designers in my practice and beyond to really pull it off and do it well. I'll give you a little bit of background to the material system and the methods and the various interactive components of lumen and their origins and maturation over a number of projects. Starting in 2012, this was a project for Nike. I was commissioned by Nike to take part in what they were calling the Flynet Collective. And they were about to launch a new technology, which we're all familiar with now, called Flynet. And to celebrate that and to launch it in conjunction, they launched the Flynet Collective, and they invited 6 artists and designers, architects from around the world, to riff on the core benefits of the Flynet, sustainability, performance, lightweight, and so on. And they were genuinely interested in how we would take those benefits back into our own fields. So I represented the States, and my city was New York City, and I developed a pavilion that incorporated the processes and parameters of knitting. I thought that was a kind of obvious jumping off point. Of the 6 participants, I was the only one that actually worked with knitting, but also integrating that with human biodata, not as a representation, but literally coupling biodata sets that were collected through a series of workshops with the knitting parameters themselves. And that in turn impacted density, the flow of forces through the knit, material effect, and so on. This was the first time that I started working with high-tech responsive fibers, which really drew upon the years of research that I had been spending on designing with light and energy, specifically working with structural color, but in this case, turning to fibers and photoluminescent responsive yarns and solar active yarns, both of which work with UV to either emit light or change color dynamically. It was also the first time that I started working with Shimaseki. They're at the forefront of what's called whole garment knitting, which is 3D seamless knitting. We have been working together since 2012 and have really pushed the boundaries in that space in terms of scale, inspiring each other, pushing each other, and ultimately developing large architectural installations and now permanent projects through knitting processes. A later project, which helped to propel the work further, was a pavilion commissioned by the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum as part of their 5th design triennial, where I was interested in returning to a number of the learnings based on cellular processes. I spent up to 8 years working deeply with Peter and his team, looking at surface design, how cells form surfaces and bifurcate and form larger morphologies and organs, not to mimic those forms, but to biosynthetically bring that thinking as an analog into these architectural questions, looking at these double surfaces and how they could work reciprocally with each other. At the same time, I started collaborating with Arup Engineering to integrate more closely the dynamics of knit. Knit is really hard to control, but that's also why it's so amazing to work with 3-dimensionally and spatially. And so we developed a whole series of these patches to understand how changes in the knit parameter would influence the flow of forces through material and geometry, extracted that data and brought it back to our own simulation tools to more accurately define things like stretch factor, right? So that we could incorporate a known stretch factor from the component to the overall assembly. Here we're working with components, both flat cells, shaped cells, as well as these cones. In the process, every component starts out as a unique element that is then sewn into a coordinated surface structure, a fabric structure. None of this work would be possible without advanced scripting and computational design. Some of it is very simple. Other aspects are a bit more complex. and certainly interfacing with the CAD/CAM technology of Shimaseki and working together. And here you can see some of the photoluminescent fibers being activated and actually highlighting as an inscription the fabrication and construction process. And one could say that knitting in many ways is an early precursor and example of 3D printing, where you're additively layering link by link, row by row material. So now I'll come to Lumen, and I'll just play this in the background. This was the video that we produced for the presentation to the jury, a very formidable jury at MoMA and MoMA PS1. The brief that year was really inspiring. Sean Anderson, who is a curator in architecture and has been in charge of YAP for a number of years now, was interested in aspects of transformation and materiality and how those dynamic conditions could become a part of the installation. I felt confident after years of R&D and these various projects, some of which I just described briefly, that this material system was ready to go outside and to really engage and respond to the sun and other contextual elements. As you may know, the YAP brief requires a water component to help cool down the hot courtyards at MoMA PS1 in Long Island City. We incorporated a misting system that dynamically responded through IR sensors to the presence of people. And we also, of course, continued to push the processes with whole garment knitting, building upon years of research in various processes, but bringing that to an altogether different scale. Another part of the brief is to include seating. So I thought this would be a unique opportunity to work with my robot in my lab, where we deconstructed recycled spools. Typically they would hold cable and other types of construction materials, took off the tops and bottoms, CNC'd them to form a cog, and then the prototypes were woven, as you saw. We did a whole series of analysis on the courtyards themselves. It was important to me that we would work with the existing environment and to develop a series of canopy interventions that would contribute to shade and shelter, and with the misting system to also locally cool the environment. One thing that I'll point out is that we also developed a full VR model of the proposal. And so when we were presenting to the jury, they actually had the goggles on and they were able to experience in a simulated VR mode how Lumen would operate as an environment. You can see here portions of that, how the misting would work, how you would sort of move through and really convey that Lumen was an environment that would transform and change from day to night. These are some images of the final installation. There are two canopy structures. I was really interested in how this above ground world would interact with the ground, the actual ground, how certain groves of cones would create connection between the two interfaces for various programmed events. There were three 42-foot tall tensegrity structures. You can see here one of them in the center, which added a third envelope of dynamic conditions to the project. The whole project was designed to be dynamic, to work with Flutter, to change during rainstorms and heavy winds and so on. Here you can see the location, the strategic location of those three towers. And I think for me, the most successful part of the project was seeing how people took ownership of it and would visit frequently, whether it was coming during the week to take a quiet lunch or to one of the warm-up events on a Saturday and to experience it differently from day to night. Here you can see some of the photoluminescent effects at night, view from the upper larger canopy, the solar active responsive fibers subtly changing. They would subtly change from white to pink to yellow to blue. And in all of my projects, there's always at least one part, maybe multiple, that becomes incredibly slow and laborious and very much about people coming together to work together and integrate elements of the human hand. And so this is a pattern drawing that my fabric finisher and sewer Daisian works from. And we've been working together for a number of years, and they literally work at scale. And so we plot one-to-one drawings, and this, when it's all tiled together, is the same size of the main courtyard. So about 150 feet in this dimension and about 90 feet in this dimension. And they said that they started on the West Coast and ended on the East Coast. Just a couple of details. The yacht project has a very, let's say, interesting budget to work within creatively. So we incorporated as much as we could off-the-shelf materials. You can see some of that in the connection hardware here. Detail of the webbing, which I'm really proud of. This is something that we've innovated over a number of years and is super important because the primary tension forces within the net are taken through the webbing and minimally so in the knit. This is an above ground view of the misting corridor. So most of, about 75% of the cones had a lead that then fed down into it with nozzles. And so the misting system ran on top and was housed within the webbing, so you wouldn't actually see that. And then another image from above at night, the smaller courtyard during the day, as well as night. And a closer view of one of those tensegrity towers. I will say there was quite a bit of creative rigging that happened at night after the museum closed during installation. Something we probably couldn't get away with now, but just a remarkable coming together of people who were just all in to really pull this off. And again, just amazing to see how people occupied the space. We did engineer the towers to take live loads, such as people climbing it. They weren't supposed to, but of course they did, especially during the warm-up days when we typically saw between 5,000 and 7,000 people coming to see these incredible DJs and various events. An image now that is kind of hard to comprehend in the context of the pandemic. But thankfully, Lumen really held up over the summer, even despite the huge parties that took place. So I'm going to close very quickly, because I know I've been speaking for close to an hour now, with a very current project that builds upon a lot of the material systems that I've described and elements of interactivity and human engagement, considering, architecture as an environment that changes and adapts, that is a bit softer and boundless in comparison to the more rigid and Cartesian structures that we occupy typically. And this is a project for Microsoft Research titled Ada, which opened last fall, and to our knowledge is the first architectural pavilion to incorporate artificial intelligence and also to open ideas around how technology can be fundamentally human-centered. And so I'll start with a little video and then I'll describe some of the details of the project. Ada is driven by artificial intelligence. It's a project that smiles back at you. The name comes from Ada Lovelace, one of the first computer programmers, and the linkages between weaving and computation. Knitting is one of the earliest examples of 3D printing, additively layering link by link, row by row material. The project features soft forms that are more feminine versus masculine, and that's a paradigm shift in architecture. The shape of Ada is an ellipsoid. It features a unique exoskeleton composed of a network of fiberglass rods and 3D printed nodes. Every single node is different and has a unique ID attached to it. The interior surface is composed of hundreds of digitally knit cones and cells in a network of webbing. In the center of Ada is a large tensegrity cone composed of a skin of fiber optic cables. Photoluminescent fiber absorbs energy from the lighting and then emits that back as knitted light, as glowing light. But the real magic comes through how people actually engage with it. On the interior soft surface is a whole network of LEDs connected to a network of cameras within the atrium, reading the facial expressions of people in an anonymous way. When Building 99 is very active, the project will be very vibrant and highly transformative. There are moments where it blushes. The hope is that people realize their engagement is actually driving the project, that the project begins to gain its own life in the way that it is interacting with people. So just to give you a bit more background, the collaboration with Microsoft Research started in the spring of 2018, and our initial conversations were around the possibility of developing a project that could incorporate artificial intelligence, but ultimately, consider how that could be human-centered and to focus on how machine learning and AI algorithms in the context of human emotion and facial pattern recognition, et cetera, could be incorporated to not only learn about our own selves and the possibility of expanding that human emotional range, but to consider research questions around how AI and those technologies could facilitate issues of well-being, health and wellness, by understanding emotion and how our local environments impact our emotive states. We also talked importantly about the ethical issues around AI and topics such as privacy and how AI potentially, when not used effectively, can be quite dangerous. And through the course of our conversations and collaboration, it became important to me to develop a project that would, unlike, say, the work of Mark Sager, try to emulate life, but instead to develop an architectural scale pavilion structure that through its material response and interactivity would serve as a kind of reflexive ground and also open up a dialogue with questions around the use of AI. It's also being used as a platform by researchers at Microsoft Research. Unfortunately, there has been some gaps in that because of COVID, but the platform and architecture of the software and how everything is interconnected can take any type of data. And so here are some views of how the project has come together. This is the first time that I've worked with an external semi-rigid exoskeleton. And so everything is working reciprocally, which gave us some interesting challenges on site during the installation. So the net is in complete tension with the compression of the exoskeleton. This diagram highlights the sort of key relationships of the software pipeline, working with a live feed of data being collected from those cameras, all anonymous, of course, and then feeding into our scripts, which translates as sentiment as color to a 3-tiered lighting system. And the camera in the central tensegrity cone can override all of the other cameras. So you start to get a sense that you're actually driving and changing the project. And another diagram just highlighting how that sentiment was translated. Again, all of this is parameterized, so you can change it accordingly. A view of the central camera and the fiber optic skin, which was a new development, very exciting in terms of the fine tuning and designing of those material responses in terms of light and color. And the opening night, which was pretty amazing to see the responses of people when they figured out that they could get Ada to blush and shudder and do different things through light and color, and kind of expand the potential of human emotional response as new information through aesthetics and beauty and wonder and playfulness. In many ways, Ada offers subtle and abstract interactions with humans through space, material, and form to augment and expand our emotional range in a specific context, and in this case, an office environment, which in turn affects the probable sentiment data being collected as new information. And in many ways, the spaces and environments that we inhabit influence and partially shape who we are and how we are feeling. And so it's through the integration of responsive materials and emerging technologies, and of course, including artificial intelligence, that Ada offers an interface for personalizing architecture to make it more human and reflexive. And so I'll conclude with this image and a slide featuring our websites. I've talked about a selection of our research and project work. There's a lot more to take in if you're interested. And we've been very fortunate to receive funding from a number of institutes and federal agencies. And hopefully I've conveyed that we are a we. I'm very fortunate to work with an incredible team, both in my studio and my lab, as well as all of my students. And one small plug for those of you that are undergrads, if you're interested in any of these ideas and pursuing an advanced research degree, we launched a few years ago a Master of Science in Matter Design Computation, which is a 2-year research degree here in the Department of Architecture at AAP. So with that, I will conclude, and hopefully we have a bit of time for some questions, which I'm very happy to take. Thanks so much for your attention. I know I went over time a little bit, but it's a pleasure being here this evening.
If I may, let me just say thank you so much for that, Jenny. This is the part where we really miss being in person and we could all hear this kind of thunderous applause. I've been receiving communications on multi-platforms and channels of people just really expressing their very sincere thanks to you for sharing this work and saying that they're really truly inspired by it. So allow me to, as best I can, communicate that to you through this Zoom portal. And I know we have a few questions lined up, and maybe I don't know if Marcus or my dad also maybe was about to say something, but I was going to maybe take advantage of the fact that I'm on here to sneak a question in here before anyone else gets to it. So I would encourage those of you who are in the audience to drop your question into the Q&A, or sometimes it's more fun to put it in the chat so everyone can sort of see it and it's a little bit more interactive. and we'll do our best to sort of filter through some of these. So if I may, Jenny, let me just ask you in a way what it's kind of a simple question, and then I'll try to explain why I'm asking it. And so the question is, what to you is human scale? So I'm not sure if my internet cut in or out, but I said, what to you is a human scale? I think you had a slide somewhere where you even had that term on the slide, and sort of with respect to kind of this idea of materials design. And the reason why I ask it to you after such a kind of packed lecture is that you know, you very thoughtfully and considerately introduced this idea of what you said at the end, a we at the beginning of the lecture, and this importance of collaboration between the disciplines, but also between humans and I think even sort of simple organisms, starting with kind of multicellular organisms that are quite small. And you described this, or described them as sort of, in a way, collaborators. And you showed us materials and the ways in which you were engineering them from the nanoscale all the way up to sort of phenomena that we can observe ourselves with our sort of human sensorium. And so sort of in light of that, what really is human scale for you when you're sort of doing this work, where clearly it seems as if, and maybe I'm taking this too far, but maybe you're somehow trying to extend or stretch sort of the limits of what might be human scale. So maybe if you could just unpack that a bit more for us, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I love this question, DK, because, you know, for me, human scale is from the cell to the body to the space that we inhabit, you know, and one of the questions that has sort of obsessed me for a number of years is how might we consider, you know, the human body as a dynamic entity that gets erased and is found back again through the materials and architecture that we then inhabit. And I mean that not as a representation or a kind of literal translation, but to consider how deep inquiry into how human cells behave, to the translation of that to a way of designing surfaces and forms that engage us differently and sort of create moments of pause. And, you know, I do think there's something about, if we take Lumen, for example, I had so many, I wish I had done a proper kind of post-occupancy analysis, because I had so many people contact me either who were visiting or after and say, you know, I wish that this was at my kid's school, or I wish this was in a park, or, you know, my mom is really sick, I wish this was in the hospital. And they talked about comfort and how, or, you know, it would just create this moment of awe or kind of pause in their busy days. And so there's something that resonates with us as humans. And I don't think it's just the non-standard nature of the form. There's something to the kind of blurred edges, the potential for the kind of infinite expanse that challenges us and pushes us into a space of reflection. And so human scale for me is the cell, is the surface, is the co-production and materiality of us with the materials themselves, and then in turn how we communicate, you know, with each other. And I know in certain projects I was a bit more literal with human scale, but it has multiple definitions in the work for sure.
Thank you.
Should we tackle some of the questions that are coming through in the Q&A in the chat?
That sounds good.
So here's one that's coming from Darla Lindberg, and she's asking, she says, thank you, Jenny. The work is amazing. You mentioned how long you've been working on this research to build collaborators and work with other expertise. So how do you collapse this to the time frame of a studio semester for seminar? Can you talk us through a semester? What's the learning curve? And I think this actually addresses one of the student questions coming from Mark Amarello, who I think is a third year this year, where he says, how do I get involved with this as a career path? How do I begin to learn this language and delve into these biosynthetic projects? How do I get started now?
Great questions. I would say the first part of my answer is push yourself into uncomfortable territory. Knock on people's doors or send an email now in our current context, or send a Zoom link to people in other disciplines, other students, professors that you may be interested in corresponding with. And that's, I think, one of the biggest hurdles, is pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone and our disciplinary kind of safe zone, if you will. And for me, it's been a process. If you asked me 20 years ago, would I be doing what I'm doing now, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it in any way. But I've always, from a very early stage, grappled with trying to find a way to integrate my interests and talents in maths and the sciences with the arts, and sort of projecting into the world and creatively working. And so that obsession led to architecture, but then it led to starting these collaborations with cell biologists and material scientists, and now many others. And so just striking up that conversation and pushing yourself into those uncomfortable territories across disciplines is so important to get started. When we started Lab Studio, to our knowledge, it was the first truly hybrid collaborative research and design entity between a biologist and an architect. And now, fortunately, for the students, there are lots of opportunities to get involved with these types of programs, or research questions in various modalities. And we could think about Achim Menges at the Institute for Computational Design at Stuttgart, dear friend and colleague, and he's really, in terms of pedagogy and research degrees, from master's to PhD, they've really taken it to another level, and working collaboratively with biologists and so on. So there are various programs here in the States and in Europe that you could consider. And to go back to the question about the timeline, I think I mentioned it early on in my talk that one of the most difficult things to teach students is getting them to let go of needing to know what the final form or the final thing will be, and to trust a process. Because in nature, these systems that we're looking at, material, geometry, history, event, program, all of this is inextricably linked, and it's relationships, and it's systemic. And this is why the ECM is just blew my mind when I started looking at it with Peter, both in terms of the scientific questions, but also the architectural potential as a thinking model. And there's always a point in a semester, whether it's more of an introductory studio or a seminar, or one of my more advanced seminars. And I usually can pinpoint it, where the students start to, kind of look at me like, what is it? No way, and then shortly thereafter, there's like this, wow, and they just get it, and they really go for it. So teaching students to work in a more bottom-up, systemic, relational fashion, and to resist the kind of fetishization of form, right? But to really think about a set of relationships that start to integrate other conditions along the way, where architecture and architectural questions start to emerge. And that shifts based on the topic that we're exploring, for sure. But the new 2-year program in matter design computation, for me, is I'm so proud of it, because it's taken 15 plus years to get to this point, where students can come in, they're funded as students in the sciences are. They get to work on core research, they get to develop a thesis, interact with students, and really take a deep dive into these concepts, and go on, you know, to industry or work on a PhD. So.
Can I tack a question on here?
Yeah.
So I was reading this little book this summer, and in it talked about the Ulm School in Germany, which we're probably familiar with. And it spoke specifically about when Thomas Maldonado came on as the kind of dean or leader of the school. He said, okay, it's 1955, post-war. We're going to start to turn our attention to economy, science, cultural studies, anthropology as the basis for design. We're going to reject intuition and subjectivity and move into a scientific way of designing for the future. So, you know, here we are half a century later or more, and you are totally immersed in the world of science. Can you talk a little bit about the role of intuition, which I think is something we still associate with architecture and growing designers, becoming designers?
Oh yeah. I mean, intuition is it's such an asset, you know, and I mean, most of my collaborators, all of my collaborators who I am also dear friends with, most of them are hugely creative and work intuitively. You know, it's such a myth that doing rigorous core science is all technical. You know, as Peter used to say to me, nobody knows the truth about these systems. You know, we're just scratching the surface. We're you know, looking at them in these various ways, but you know, he would talk about the best scientists are the most creative thinkers at the same time. And intuition is about connecting those dots, you know, and making leaps, which comes back to the point I made about with the early 3D printing work. We were thinking about what is it, how am I holding data, like having a physical data set in your hand. And of course it's going through a scale transformation, and it's all of a sudden you have different material and so on and so forth. But the interest was like the creative projection that holding a 3D printed version of a multicellular structure would provide to the scientist, you know, and to project into that space in a different way. And intuition is so much a part of those moments of kind of, wow. And I mean, related to that, for us early on, one of the most important bridges was visualization and simulation, and bringing not just our technical skills, but a way of thinking to these scientific questions that comes from design, and specifically, in my case, computational design, working parametrically. So there was already thinking in place that immediately translated, because like many fields and disciplines, we have the ability now to generate abundant data, tons of data, but an inability to make sense of it. And so it's impacting the scientific process, like the reductive process of repetition of a singularity is shifting. And now it's about looking at trends and behavior and events within, you know, this information space. And so design and training in architecture in some ways you could say has never been more important in our current paradigm. And so I encourage all of you, you know, not to say that you shouldn't go out and be amazing architects, but you can also go out and be amazing architects working alongside material scientists and biologists and physicists, making real impact in the world. And it's a scary time, but it's your time, right? Go out and just develop practices that are, you know, expansive and alternative, because the role of design right now is so needed, so necessary. And intuition is so much a part of that. I mean, working rigorously and with intention and responsibility, but intuition it helps us, you know, move through the landscape, so to speak.
Thank you. We had a question again from one of our faculty, Felicia Davis, that wanted to know some kind of backstory or something, or something that you can say that basically talks about scaling up and getting industry involved in this kind of work. So kind of moving beyond an academic lab and really engaging industry partners. And she specifically mentions challenges of the bottom line and essentially a much different pace of work. And she asks specifically, has your lab had time to strategize this tricky translation or this tricky next step of scaling up and meeting industry partners?
Yeah, thanks, Felicia, for that really important question. And I wish we could be, again, in person. In fact, I think one of the last events, Felicia, that we all participated in, or at least I participated in person, was when we were joint panelists on a event at USC. And I think some of these things came up. But so in terms of the question pertaining to time, I haven't had enough time to really strategize. And that is definitely something that is front and center. I mean, I'm so exhausted. Like, we've been just racing, it's project after project after research grant after research grant. And I feel like I'm now at a point where I desperately need, but also I'm really, really excited about shifting a little bit where my energy is going, of course, continuing with the projects and the research. But I think I've gotten a bit more strategic with how I can delegate things and shifting a bit of my time towards these strategies and thinking through in a smart way how to push these various projects into the built environment, because it's, as you point out, Felicia, it's so hard. And one example that I'll give, actually, this came out of a symposium that I organized with the colleague Maria Paz Guterres, who many of you may know, who's at Berkeley. And it was the first architect-led symposium as part of the Materials Research Society, which is the largest annual gathering of materials scientists. And we invited papers from a number of different disciplines on the topic of adaptive architecture and programmable matter. And this very question, similar to yours, Felicia, came up. And we realized that there were very important people that weren't at the table that needed to be there, lawyers, to discuss the litigious issues of how to move these materials into the built environment. Economists, MBA students, there are so many hoops to surpass. And I don't have a clear answer for you, but I think, maybe what we should do for those of us that are doing this type of work is organize that next symposium that's about strategizing and working together on some of these big questions and hurdles.
I don't know where to start with some of the nitty gritty questions. There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A that are asking you about specific knitting softwares and specific softwares, and I think I kind of want to stay away from those kinds of things. I think the answers may be out there, and students can find them. But there is a question from one of our fifth-year thesis students that I think you might have some advice for her. Ashlyn Wilson asks about, she's a student doing a thesis. She's doing some material-based research work, and she feels like she doesn't have access to collaborating with scientists. She doesn't have access to people who are running labs that would invite a 50-year architecture student in. How can she do a materials-based research project as an architect in an architectural studio, kind of solo? Do you have any thoughts?
That's a great question. Before I answer it, I will say to those of you that have very nitty-gritty questions about specific aspects of the projects, I encourage you, as I mentioned, to visit either Jenny Sabin's studio or the Sabin Lab website, where we have a number of papers that talk about the software, talk about the fabrication methods, and so on. To the fifth-year thesis student, sounds like an awesome thesis project. That's really, really great. What I would encourage, I've found that, for example, in engineering programs, it's very common for the students to work in teams. And it's also typically a really inviting space for collaboration. And that's worked really well in my lab. I mean, the best times in my lab are when I have students coming in from computer science and material science and biology and mechanical engineering, where there's just an incredible vibe around the collaborative exchange. But a lot of the engineering projects are group-based, and they love designers, they love architects, and they love the way you think. So I would encourage you to contact professors in the engineering department at your university and see if there are certain courses, like they have studio, where you could participate in some way. And in turn, you know, you also would have that collaborative experience that could give back to your project. That's often the case in material science too, especially at the undergrad level. So I would reach out and look at some of the courses and see if there are ways that you can collaborate.
Here's a question again from one of our Masters of Architecture degree students who's in her final year. And she asked if you could essentially just talk a little bit about what you see as this differentiation between feminine and masculine forms. She said, you know, I was really interested in this, and you kind of mentioned these ideas of specific forms. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I've actually, it's something I spent the entire summer grappling with. And now I don't know if I would still use those terms. Yeah, it's something I'm working through. But what I mean, and I think this was in the Ada video, is not male and female in terms of a gender definition, but more of a meta level to, you know, consider feminine and masculine space and how that may or may not pertain to differences in geometric languages, kind of some of the aspects that I described in terms of infinity and borderless opportunities of the non-standard of part to whole. But I've since, over the course of the summer and writing a couple of essays and chapters, started to move away from that into exploring the term transdisciplinary and where transdisciplinary emanated from. It's not that old as a term, and how that relates to the trans individual. And there's a really, really interesting kind of philosophy around that. A number of thinkers from Spinoza to Simondon, more contemporary philosophers, which starts to point to kind of post-gender. And this is where I'm interested in maybe extracting the word feminine and masculine from the description or the argument into a space that is more about ourselves and the becoming of a self in the context of relationships of each other. you know, Donna Haraway, one of my heroes, put on the map the metaphor of the cyborg as a kind of post-gendered entity, and it, you know, the cyborg's relationships with machines and technology and so on and so forth. So it's, again, it's another related to Felicia's question around strategy, starting to carve out the space that I need to define the work a bit more explicitly in larger bodies of philosophy and thought, and even, you know, gender studies and so on. But if you haven't read Donna Haraway, whoever had the question, if you're interested in those topics, it should blow your mind.
Well, Jenny, I'll start by saying thank you as we wind things down. And before DK jumps in here to formally wind things down, I just want to say thank you so much. And this lecture will get us a lot of mileage. You're a guest here, but you know, bricks, VR, 3D printing, biomimicry, machine knitted textiles, clay printing. These are all topics that are on the tip of our tongues as a school every day. And they've been growing here in the school for years. And so much of what you talked about tonight has resonance with our community. And so we just want to thank you so much as a guest for coming in and kind of exploding all of those things at once. And, you know, so inspiring and so connected to the things that we're interested in as a school right now. So you really hit the nail on the head, and thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you so much, Marcus. It's really a pleasure, and I look forward in the future to hopefully, you know, visiting as a outside critic or something like that. I'd love to see the work. It sounds like a really exciting and vibrant time.
Since DK, you're going to close, I will just also say thank you, Jenny. I think it was amazing the way your descriptions went from nuts and bolts and materials, and you know, people had software questions and how did you do this, how did you do that? And I think at the other end of the spectrum, we're looking at serious questions about theory and philosophy of architecture and its relationship to nature. So it was fabulous, and it is not our first lecture of the season, but it is the first architecture lecture of the season. So it was an absolute kickoff, as Marcus put it wildly. It was explosive. So you put everything on the map for us. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that in a post-COVID era, we can connect again. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I think really everything has been said, so I'll just say thank you for taking all of this time, Jenny. We really appreciate it. And I think particularly this call for, I think, the students who are still on this Zoom to be bold enough to face sort of these open-ended design investigations. And since, especially right now at this moment, we have no idea what's going to happen in the future. And I think so many things that we thought sort of are normal have now been exploded. I think this is really inspirational work for us all to see at this moment as we try to reinvent the future, and really from sort of materials up. So thank you again so much for taking so much time and sharing all of this with us. We hope to continue this conversation into the future. Thank you.
Likewise. Yeah, no, you can count on it. Thanks again for the opportunity and the kind invitation. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and best to you in your semester.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks again.
Clapping.